Tomatoes can be very easy to grow in the garden. That's one reason why they're the favorite of so many gardeners. But by making just a few common mistakes, you may be hindering your tomato success. Hi, I'm GardenerScott. I'm a master gardener who discusses everything gardening so that you can become a better gardener. Today, I'll discuss some common tomato growing mistakes. My tomato plants are still relatively small. I had a pretty big setback after a very severe storm. But even though they're small, I'm anticipating a lot of growth and a very abundant harvest. Wherever you're at in your growing season, whether you have small plants or large plants, these common mistakes are probably in your way. These are the kind of issues you should be concerned about, because if you confront them and correct them, you can have an abundant harvest too. The first mistake is not fully understanding the variety of the tomato that you're growing. And this is very common, not just for brand new gardeners. First off, there are two different types of tomatoes. There are determinate and indeterminate, and they grow differently. A determinate tomato grows to pretty much a predetermined size, usually 3 or 4 feet tall and wide. It'll set all the flowers within a very brief period of time, and then all the fruit results in a brief period of time as well. After that, the plant is essentially done. You may get a few tomatoes, but not a lot. Determinate tomatoes are great if you want a whole bunch at the same time. San Marzano and Roma are very common determinate tomatoes, and they're used to make sauce, because when you make sauce, you want a whole bunch of tomatoes right now. Well, that's wonderful. But if you're the kind of gardener that wants to go out and harvest a tomato today and tomorrow and next week and next month, you're looking for indeterminate tomatoes, because those are more like a vine. They'll grow, set flowers, set fruit, then grow some more. Set more flowers, set more fruit, and grow some more. So you get a continual harvest. Understanding that difference can make a huge impact on your harvest and what your expectations are for growing tomatoes in the first place. Also, you have to anticipate whether your plant is a hybrid or an heirloom. Now, the tastes will be different based on the variety, and how they grow will be different based on variety, because there are benefits to hybrids and there are benefits to heirlooms. But if you're looking forward to saving the seed of your tomatoes to grow next year, well, it's an open pollinated variety, typically an heirloom, that you should be looking for. If you have very specific concerns about diseases that might be in your garden or in your area, then you may want to look at a hybrid, because there are many hybrids that have been developed that aren't as susceptible to some of the very common tomato diseases. Because just by looking at a picture on a seed packet or reading a description in a catalog or liking the name of a tomato doesn't mean it's going to match your region, your desires, and ultimately what kind of harvest you want. This next mistake is probably the most common. It's improper watering. And all of us seem to overwater or underwater because it's just hard to get right. And all the tomato wants is a nice, consistently moist soil. But because of sun and dry air and wind and the containers we're growing in, it's so hard to get right. I hand water my tomatoes after I've checked the soil moisture with my finger, just sticking my finger in to see whether the plants need water or not. And it varies based on your soil and where you're growing your tomatoes. So in these grow bags, I have tomatoes, and I have to water these more often because the bags tend to dry out on a pretty regular basis, daily. The tomatoes I'm growing behind me in these straw bales, I don't have to water as often because the straw holds a lot of moisture. The tomatoes that are in my concrete block bed, I can also get away with a little less watering because it's set in the ground, it's good soil, and it tends to retain a lot of that moisture. Watering your tomatoes is often best done with a soaker hose or drip irrigation, because the last thing you want to be doing, aside from overwatering and underwatering, is putting so much water on the ground that it causes the soil to bounce back onto the leaves, because most of the tomato diseases are soil-borne. So you don't want all of that bacteria and the fungal spores bouncing onto your leaves. So it's best to water the base of the plant. A lot of those diseases, particularly the fungal diseases, are looking for nice wet leaves to grow. Well, you don't want to be watering the top of your plant and the leaves, because possibly you're making your plant susceptible to some diseases. Again, another reason to be watering the base. Check with your finger, think about your container, anticipate potential problems with disease, and you should have better success when it comes to watering your plants. The next mistake is not using mulch. And mulch has so many great benefits, but chief among them when it comes to tomatoes is dealing with those issues I just discussed. You don't have to worry about the fungal spores and the bacteria bouncing onto the leaves if you have mulch in place. It's covering the soil. And so all of those potential diseases that might be in your soil are blocked by the mulch. The mulch also helps retain a lot of the soil moisture. The soil's not going to lose a lot of that moisture through evaporation when there's a mulch in place. The mulch also gradually breaks down if it's organic and adds nutrients to the soil naturally. Another great benefit that your tomatoes will benefit from. Use mulch. What type of mulch is not critical. I suggest organic. I use straw, I use dried leaves, I use dried grass. A lot of people use wood chips. Even plastic is an opportunity for mulch. The key is mulch your soil and you'll have fewer problems with your tomatoes. The fourth mistake is all too common, and that's over-fertilization. Mostly because gardeners get a lot of bad advice. We're told that we need to fertilize our tomatoes, and so we fertilize and fertilize and fertilize, but that's not what you should be doing. First off, if you have a nice nutrient-rich soil, you probably don't need fertilizer at all. And secondly, you really have to know what kind of fertilizer you're using, because a lot of the recommendations are for a balanced fertilizer, a 10-10-10 or a 12-12-12. And here's where the problem comes in. It's with the nitrogen, that first number. When tomatoes get too much nitrogen, you're actually going to have some problems. First off, the nitrogen causes the plant to grow, to send out new stems and new leaves, and not focus on the flower and the fruit. So you may get a huge green plant with no fruit on it. That's a sign of too much nitrogen. Also, blossom end rot is a very common problem. It's a calcium deficiency, usually caused by underwatering or overwatering, because most of our soils have ample calcium. But a lot of gardeners throw calcium in their soil and they throw calcium at their plants, and it has absolutely no effect whatsoever. It could be, again, too much nitrogen, because as the plant grows, as it sends up new growth, the calcium that's in the soil is being sent to that new growth, not to the fruit. So the fruit gets blossom end rot. And a lot of that new green growth that's caused by too much nitrogen is the perfect food for caterpillars and a lot of the other pests. So if you have pests that are inundating your tomato bed, it could be because you've got too much nitrogen. If you see a need to fertilize, focus on a tomato-specific fertilizer. And usually that very first number, the nitrogen, is small because the plants need the phosphorus and the potassium, not so much nitrogen. Just be aware of how you're fertilizing your tomatoes. The fifth mistake is not giving your tomato plants enough support. And that's not emotional support, that's actual support. Because tomato plants can get quite large, especially the indeterminate tomatoes. So you need something strong. You need a trellis that the tomato plants can go up. Now, you can bypass this completely and just let your tomatoes sprawl out over the ground. That's okay. But I guarantee you that if you let your tomatoes sprawl, at the end of the season, you will find a whole bunch of tomato fruit underneath leaves that you never even saw. So if you really want to get the most harvest, get your plants off the ground. Get them growing vertically so that you can see all the fruit and harvest everything. A determinate tomato plant doesn't need as much support, but it can get pretty big and bushy. So think in terms of a large tomato cage. Those small, flimsy ones are absolutely worthless when it comes to tomatoes. If you're growing the indeterminate types that are going to get large and bushy with lots of fruit, then I use these cattle panel hoops to support a lot of tomato plants underneath, and they'll grow up. This can hold a lot of weight. And also that vertical trellis behind me I use around my concrete block bed. That can support the weight of a lot of tomatoes, because if you're doing it right, your tomato plants are going to get 6, 8, even 10 feet tall, loaded with fruit. So give them the support that they need. And I have videos that show how I do this. There's lots of other information out there. Just do it. Give your tomato support. The next mistake is improper pruning. And there's a lot of reasons for this. You have to do it. You have to figure out how to prune your tomatoes, and you'll figure it out over time. You'll get the experience to do it. But there's some misinformation that could lead you in the wrong direction. First off, when you're growing indeterminate tomatoes, as I said earlier, there's spores, there's bacteria that could infect the lower leaves. So cut off those lower leaves. I prune off the lower 15 to 18 inches of stems and branches from my tomato plants, and that greatly lessens the possibility of a disease that might infect my plant. The next step is to actually think about how you want your plant to grow. Now, I'm growing vertically up this trellis, and you've probably heard that with indeterminate tomatoes, you prune off or pinch off all of the suckers. Well, that can lead to a really nice tall plant with a single stem, but it's going to cut back on some of your production, because all of those suckers will grow into pretty strong stems, and those stems will grow flowers and fruit. So if you want a lot of fruit, you shouldn't be pruning off those suckers at all. And if it's a determinate tomato, you should definitely not prune off any of those suckers. There's a lot of gardeners, especially new gardeners, who are growing determinate tomatoes. They hear that they're supposed to pinch off all of the suckers, and they do so, and they get very little fruit. Because on that bushy, determinate tomato plant, it's all of those suckers that are going to provide that bushiness. So learn about the pruning. Figure out how you want the plant to grow. And I have other videos that discuss this. Don't be indiscriminate. Don't just prune to prune. Have a reason for it. Pruning off those lower leaves because of disease, pruning off some of the suckers because you don't want the plant to get too overwhelming. All of that is fine. Just try to understand what it is you're doing and avoid over pruning. Many gardeners are oblivious that they might even have this seventh mistake, and it is spreading disease. A lot of gardeners spread tomato diseases without even realizing it. Now, I've already talked about the watering and the mulch and the trellising. That's what I do to reduce my risk of disease, and it's been quite effective. But disease can find its way to the garden, and that's where you need to be vigilant. You need to learn about the symptoms, the leaves, the fruit, how you can identify specific tomato diseases. And some diseases aren't that bad. Most of us have early blight and late blight. We can deal with it. It's extremely common. But some of the more severe tomato diseases need to be dealt with right away. So if you see the leaves changing colors, or if you see the mottled look on your leaves, or the fruit is getting deformed, learn about what's causing it, because the solution probably should be pulling the plant out of the ground and throwing it away. We're too often told that we should compost, and we should compost everything, and this is where the problem lies. You have a diseased plant, and either at the end of the season or after you notice that there's a disease, you put it in your compost pile. Well, that spreads disease when you add that compost to the rest of your beds. And once it gets into the soil, it can take years before that disease goes away. And in the interim, you shouldn't be planting your tomatoes in diseased soil. If you've got a small garden, that could have a huge impact. So try to avoid disease in the first place. When you recognize that you do have disease, get rid of the plant so that it doesn't infect the soil or possibly a plant that's right next to it. If you make any of these mistakes, don't worry about it. They're very common and they're correctable. The key is that you're aware of them so that you can start making progress in the direction to get the best tomato plants and the most harvest that you possibly can. If you benefited from this video, well, consider giving it a thumbs up and sharing it with others who might be interested. And be sure to subscribe to the GardenerScott channel if you haven't already done so, and click on the bell so you know when new videos are coming out. I'm GardenerScott. Enjoy gardening.